At 23:40 on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll C. Smith crouched inside the tight cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at Moorefield, Morrow, watching as his radar operator tracked a contact moving at 180 knots through the pitch-black skies north of the Philippine Islands. He was 26 years old, had flown 43 combat missions, and scored 4 confirmed kills. That night, the Japanese had dispatched 12 bombers to destroy the American airfields. Smith knew the routine. For 2 weeks, Japanese bombers had attacked Morrow every single night, 334 air raid alerts in just 14 days. American engineers were constructing 2 airfields to support the Lingayen Gulf invasion, and the Japanese clearly understood their importance. If American fighters could operate from Morrow, they would be able to protect the entire invasion force. Construction had to be stopped. As a result, bombers were sent every night, conventional bombers, kamikazes, anything capable of carrying explosives. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Morrow only 3 days earlier. On December 26, Smith's squadron was the sole barrier between those bombers and 20,000 American troops sleeping in tents below. The pressure was crushing. Every bomber that slipped through meant dead engineers, dead construction crews, damaged airfields, delayed operations, and more American casualties at Lingayen Gulf. Smith's P-61 was unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. The Northrop Black Widow was the first American aircraft designed specifically for night combat. It had a 66-foot wingspan and twin Pratt & Whitney Air 2800 engines producing 2,000 horsepower each, with a top speed of 366 miles per hour. But its true weapon was not the 420mm cannons mounted in the belly. It was the SCR-720 radar installed in the nose. That radar could detect aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese had no idea such a system existed. Their bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them invisible. They were wrong. The radar operator sat behind Smith in a separate compartment, staring at a glowing screen that revealed every aircraft within range. Lieutenant Philip Porter was Smith's radar operator. He had been tracking targets for 6 months and knew how to read the scope, how to vector Smith toward contacts, and how to distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy bombers. The problem was straightforward and merciless: 1 P-61 against 12 Japanese bombers. If Smith engaged a single target, 11 others could slip through to bomb the airfields. The mathematics were unforgiving. Even if Smith shot down 3 or 4 bombers, the remainder would still reach their objectives. American casualties would increase. The airfields would suffer damage. The invasion timetable would be pushed back. Smith had trained for this moment for 18 months, night fighter instruction at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida, radar intercept procedures, night navigation, and gunnery practice in total darkness. The training was intense because night fighting was the most dangerous form of aerial combat. There were no visual references, no visible horizon, only instruments, radar returns, and the constant fear that the target being tracked might be friendly. The 418th had flown its first combat mission in November 1943, operating from primitive airstrips in New Guinea, initially flying P-70 Havocs and later modified P-38 Lightnings equipped with experimental radar. The P-61s arrived in September 1944. The Black Widow was everything the earlier night fighters were not: stable, forgiving, and powerful. Most importantly, the radar actually worked. But radar alone could not solve Smith's problem tonight. 12 bombers were inbound. His fuel would last perhaps 3 hours. If he spent 10 minutes engaging each target, he could intercept only 3 bombers before needing to return to base. 9 bombers would get through. 9 bombers meant hundreds of casualties, possibly thousands if they struck fuel dumps or ammunition storage. If you want to see how Smith hunted down 4 Japanese bombers in total darkness, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Smith. 3:42, Porter's voice crackled through the intercom. He had 4 separate contacts on the scope, all heading south toward Morrow, all flying at different altitudes. Smith had to decide which bomber to pursue first and whether his plan to intercept all 4 in one night was brilliance or suicide. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin Air 2800 engines responded instantly, and the Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out vectors: heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith saw nothing through the canopy but darkness. There was no moon, no stars, and heavy clouds obscured everything. This was why the Japanese had chosen this night. Complete darkness made their bombers invisible to conventional fighters. But Smith was not flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar used a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the nose, sending out microwave pulses 180 degrees forward. When those pulses struck an aircraft, they reflected back. On the radar operator's scope, the return appeared as a glowing blip. The system used 2 displays, one showing azimuth left or right of the aircraft's nose, the other showing elevation above or below the aircraft. Porter monitored both scopes at once, guiding Smith with precise verbal corrections: left 5 degrees, down 3 degrees. The system worked because Porter was exceptionally skilled. Range 3 miles. Smith activated his own radar scope, a smaller display integrated into the main instrument panel. Once the target was close enough, Smith could track it himself. The pilot's scope was simpler than Porter's, just a single display showing range and relative position, but it was sufficient. Once Smith had the target locked on his scope, he could close for the kill without relying on verbal guidance. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Americans as the Betty. It was powered by two 2,000 horsepower Mitsubishi Kasei engines, had a maximum speed of 270 miles per hour, carried a crew of 7, and could haul a bomb load of 1,760 pounds. The Betty had a fatal flaw: it lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst from Smith's cannons would turn the bomber into a fireball. Range 2 miles. Smith could now see the target clearly on his scope. The blip was steady. The bomber crew had no idea he was behind them. Japanese bombers had no tail warning radar, no way to detect a pursuing night fighter. They flew on through the darkness. Convinced they were safe, the P-61 made that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards, still couldn't see the Betty visually. The darkness was absolute. He relied entirely on the radar scope. The blip grew larger as the range decreased. 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally saw it. A dark shape against slightly less dark clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible. Faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. Smith moved the P-61 into position slightly below the bomber. Slightly behind. The 420mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage. Fixed forward, Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel. The gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass. Smith adjusted his position until the bomber sat centered in the reticle. Range 400 yards. Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon carried 200 rounds, 800 rounds total, enough for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. But Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine called for short, concentrated bursts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill, move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on a single bomber meant fewer rounds for the remaining targets. Smith squeezed the trigger at 350 yards. The 4 cannons fired in unison. The sound was deafening even through the engine noise. 20mm high explosive shells streamed toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers looked like red lines drawn across the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds. 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall. The burning aircraft illuminated the clouds below. It hit the water 8 miles north of Morro at 23:57. 1 bomber down, 11 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd burned through 15% of his fuel, and 3 more contacts were still on Porter's scope. All heading toward the airfields, all separated by miles of black sky. And Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Porter identified the second target at 0014 on December 30th, heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended. The problem was geometry. The second bomber was 23 miles from the first kill. Smith's P-61 cruised at 280 miles per hour. That meant roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent flying closer to Morro, closer to the airfields, closer to completing its mission. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster, 320 miles per hour. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate at high power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol time, but if he didn't intercept the bomber quickly, it would reach the target zone. American anti-aircraft gunners would open fire. The bomber might get shot down or it might release its bombs. Either way, Smith would have failed. The mathematics of night interception were brutal. Most night fighter missions ended without contact. The sky was enormous. Even with radar, finding a single bomber required perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Finding 4 bombers in one night was nearly impossible. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills total since arriving in the Pacific Theater. 18 kills in 14 months. Smith already had 4 kills to his name. Adding 4 more in one night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the war. But records didn't matter. What mattered was stopping those bombers. Porter called out corrections. Smith adjusted heading. The second contact grew stronger on the radar scope. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile. Another Betty. Same profile, same vulnerable fuel tanks. The bomber was lower than the first one. 6,000 feet instead of 8,000. Closer to the cloud layer. That gave Smith less room to maneuver. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast and he'd overshoot. Too slow and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters relied on surprise. Once the enemy knew you were there, everything changed. Bomber crews would take evasive action. Gunners would open fire. The clean intercept would turn into a dogfight. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly. Dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew was flying straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. No indication they knew Smith was there. The P-61's black paint made it nearly invisible at night. The engines were quiet compared to most fighters. The Japanese called the P-61 the Black Widow. They feared it, but fear only worked if they knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range 350 yards. He fired. 2C. Burst. 48 rounds. The shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire immediately, then the left. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water at 0019. 17 minutes after midnight, 2 bombers down, 10 remaining, but Smith's fuel gauge showed 42% remaining. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope. Both were closer to Morrow than the previous targets. Both were at different altitudes. One at 9,000 feet, one at 4,000 ft, and they were 8 miles apart. Smith made a decision. He would take the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than descending rapidly, but the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get closer to the airfields. If Smith made the wrong choice, one bomber would get through and the entire mission would be considered a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 0023. Porter locked onto the third contact. Range 7 miles, heading 160, speed 190 knots. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Bettys and it was taking evasive action, turning, changing altitude. Someone aboard that aircraft knew the Americans had night fighters in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donu. The Americans called it Helen. Faster than the Betty. Maximum speed 306 miles per hour. Better defensive armament. 57.7 mm machine guns. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Approaching from dead astern would put Smith in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and to the left, the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith exploited that weakness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, descending 300. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Porter compensated by predicting the bombers' movements, watching the pattern, anticipating the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot made a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin boom configuration gave it excellent stability. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith kept the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range 500 yards, 450. 400, at 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streamed past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was Gone. Smith had seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive action. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst. 72 rounds. Longer than his previous attacks. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield, with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Morro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting, no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 m out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gal total, necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It hit the water at 0029. 29 minutes after midnight, 3 bombers down, 9 remaining, but Smith's fuel gauge showed 28%. Critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 30% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing or worse. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter had one more contact on his scope. The fourth target heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Morro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfields. Thin beams of white light sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the fourth bomber. Diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above, use gravity to increase his speed, reduce the time the target had to react. Range 4M 3M 2M, Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Morro. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area or didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill below and behind 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds remaining, enough for 3 more attacks, maybe 4 if he was conservative. But this was the fourth target. He needed to make every shot count. Smith's fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. 1 chance, 1 burst, then he had to return to base. Whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying, Smith fired at 0034. 2 con burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The bomber's port wings separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. It impacted at 0035, 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Morro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The mathematical calculation was simple. McGuire Field was 18 m south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gal at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 36 minutes, more than enough to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their Nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact, but Smith's night wasn't over. At 0042, Porter detected a new contact. Heading north. Range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field. Fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfield Smith had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much fuel. Smith might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse, letting a Japanese bomber reach Manuro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber got through and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died, because Smith prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hay-8. The Americans called it Frank, a single-engine fighter. Maximum speed 392 miles per hour. 4 12.7 mm machine guns. 2 20 mm cannons. One of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, better rate of. In daylight, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith had one advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know Smith was there. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit, and the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yard. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach McGuire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Future intercepts would be more difficult. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. The mathematics were clear. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15% below minimum safety margin, but letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at 0045. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds, the longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right in dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute open, a white canopy against black sky. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 0046. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 15%. 13% meant 84 gall remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, that meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel, barely. At 0052, Smith spotted the runway lights. 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet long, crushed coral surface. Engineers had completed construction on December 26, the same day the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations, but lacked the safety features of established airfields, no overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. At night, with minimal lighting, any landing error would likely be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, 57 gall. The P-61 consumed fuel faster during landing approach. Power settings fluctuated. Engine spooled up during turns, spooled down during descents. Each power change consumed additional fuel. Smith calculated he had approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough to land, unless something went wrong. At 0055, something went wrong. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness. Smith was 3 m from the runway. Altitude 800 feet, airspeed 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. The P-61 would hit the ground before Smith realized how low he was flying. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter. The device measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface accurate to within 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning. Navigation. When the altimeter showed 0 feet, he would be on the ground. The technique was dangerous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway, hitting trees or coral reefs or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gall, 8 minutes of flight time. Not enough to divert to another airfield. Taqabad-on-Leh was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. The P-61 would run out of fuel 40 m short. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights, or crash into the ocean and hope someone rescued him before he drowned. The decision was simple. Smith had survived 4 intercepts, 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. He had saved American lives on the ground, protected the airfields, enabled the Lingayen Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the entire mission meaningless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was located. His altitude was 600 feet, fuel at 9%. And the darkness below was absolute. Smith descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. He reduced airspeed to 120 knots. The P-61 stall speed was 95 knots with flaps fully extended. Flying at 120 knots gave Smith a 25-knot safety margin. Not much, but descending slower would consume more fuel. The mathematics were unforgiving. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Morro showed clearly. Moorfield was inland, approximately 1 mile from the beach. Smith used compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading was 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle or construction areas or coral reefs. At 0058, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear. Under each engine necessor forward fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was robust, designed to handle rough airfields. But landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard, collapse the gear, the aircraft would cartwheel. At 120 knots, the crew would not survive. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%, 36 gall, 5 minutes remaining. He extended flaps to full. The P-61's airspeed decreased to 110 knots. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet 150. Smith couldn't see the ground. No lights, no visual references, just instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. At 100-foot altitude, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. 75 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Smith prepared for touchdown. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral at 0059. The impact was harder than normal. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly, 100 knots, 80, 60, 40. The Aircraft slowed to taxi speed at 20 knots. Smith couldn't see where he was on the runway. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights. They guided Smith to the parking area. The P-61's engine shut down at 0103. 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were stiff. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind. Landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. Porter climbed out from the radar operator's compartment. He had tracked 5 targets successfully, vetoed Smith to each intercept, maintained radar contact throughout the engagement. Without Porter's skill, none of the kills would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort. Pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The ground crew inspected the P-61. No damage. All 4 cannons had functioned correctly. Total ammunition expended, 408 rounds. Smith had started the mission with 800 rounds. He landed with 392 rounds remaining. Enough ammunition for 2 more intercepts, but zero fuel for pursuing additional targets. Intelligence officers arrived at 0115. They wanted details, times, locations, altitudes, aircraft types. Smith provided the information from memory. For Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima K-49 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, all destroyed. 357 on December 29th, and 0046 on December 30th, total engagement time 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light. For bombers, 1 fighter, all exactly where Smith reported. 4 kills in 1 night equaled the record for American night fighters. But Smith wasn't finished. On December 30, 1944, at 14:30 hours, Smith flew his second mission of the day. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted over Muro. Single-engine fighters, faster than bombers, more difficult to intercept. Smith and Porter took off in the same P-61. The aircraft had been refueled and rearmed. 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 646 gallons of fuel. At 1512, Porter detected a contact heading north. Altitude 12,000 feet, range 8 miles. Smith climbed to intercept. The target was another Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, faster than the P-61 in level flight, but Smith had altitude advantage. He dove on the Frank from above. The diving attack increased his speed to 390 miles per hour, faster than the Frank's maximum level speed. Smith fired at 400 yards. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and dove into the ocean. Smith's 7th kill. The final victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Muro through January 1945. The unit achieved 18 confirmed kills during the war, the highest total recorded by any P-61 squadron in the Pacific Theater. Smith's 7 victories accounted for 39% of the squadron's overall tally. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his work as a radar operator. His expertise made every successful intercept possible. The P-61 times A. Watson continued flying combat missions through May 1945. The aircraft survived the war without damage after VJ Day, but it was scrapped along with most Black Widows. Only 4 P-61s exist today, and none of them is Smith's aircraft. The nose art, the kill markings, the plane that hunted down 4 bombers in 80 minutes, everything was lost to history. Moorfield supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion exactly as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945, with P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from Muro to provide air cover. The airfield Smith defended on December 29 made that air cover possible. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs striking the construction areas would have delayed completion of the airfields by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant the invasion itself would have been postponed, casualties would have increased, and the war would have dragged on longer. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, and never sought attention or publicity. He never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives, unit histories, intelligence summaries, and the dry paperwork of confirmed kills and missions completed. The P-61 Black Widow demonstrated what night fighters were capable of. 700 aircraft were built and deployed in every theater: the European, Pacific, China-Burma, India, and Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated the F-61, remained in service until 1954, and was then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with greater performance. But in December 1944, over Morrow, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the finest pilot flying it. If this story affected you the way it affected us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day, stories about pilots who saved lives with radar, real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community spans the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Major Carroll Smith does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible.